The first time Garrett Aldridge looked at me, I understood exactly what kind of trouble I was in. Not the ordinary trouble, not the kind that came from speaking out of turn or moving too slowly or being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The everyday trouble that a person learned to navigate on a plantation, the way you learn to navigate a field full of things that could hurt you, by memorizing the landscape and watching where you put your feet. That trouble I had been navigating since I was old enough to understand that the landscape existed and that it was mine to navigate or be destroyed by. This was a different trouble. This was the trouble that came from being seen in a particular way by a particular kind of man, and I had been seen that way before, but never by someone with the specific combination of power and intention and absolute certainty of his own right to whatever he wanted that Garrett Aldridge carried in the way he occupied space, the way he moved through a room as if the room had been built for him and everything in it existed at his discretion. I was 21 years old. He was 26. His father had given me to him the previous Tuesday. Not given in the sense of a gift exactly, though that was the language that was used. Given in the sense that property is transferred from one owner to another when the first owner decides the second owner has a use for it. Cornelius Aldridge, who had owned me since I was 9 years old and who had worked me in the fields of his tobacco plantation in Brunswick County, Virginia, for 12 years, with the efficiency that tobacco required and the indifference to the people doing the work that tobacco encouraged, had looked at me one morning in September of 1849 and made an assessment. The assessment was that I was too beautiful for field work. He said this to his overseer, a man named Jacks, in the tone of a man making a practical observation about resource allocation. He said that it was wasteful to put a girl who looked the way I looked in the tobacco fields when there were uses for her elsewhere that would produce better returns. He said this without looking at me. He was looking at his tobacco. Jacks agreed. I was reassigned to the house that afternoon. The house was not an improvement in the way that people who had not lived it might imagine. The house was a different kind of difficulty, with its own landscape of things that could hurt you, and its own requirement that you memorize that landscape and watch where you put your feet. The house was where the Aldridge family lived their private life, which meant the house was where the private life of a family could reach you in ways that the field could not. And the private life of the Aldridge family was not something that benefited from proximity. Cornelius Aldridge was 58 years old and had built his tobacco operation in Brunswick County over 30 years with the particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that successful planter operations required. He had a wife named Harriet, who was 52, and who managed the house with the efficiency of a woman who had long since accepted that her primary function was the maintenance of the domestic infrastructure that supported her husband's public life. He had 2 daughters who had married and left Brunswick County and who returned for Christmas and the occasional summer visit. And he had Garrett. Garrett was the only son, the heir, the person for whom everything that had been built was being maintained and expanded and eventually transferred, the center of Cornelius Aldridge's planning, in the way that sons were the centers of their father's planning in that time and place and class. Garrett was 25 when I came to the house, 26 the following spring, when his father called him into the study and told him that the girl from the fields, the one they had moved to the house in the autumn, was being given to him. For his personal use. Those were the words Cornelius Aldridge used, and they were accurate words, and they described accurately what was being offered and what was being intended. I know what was said in that study because I was standing in the hallway outside it with a tray of coffee that I had been sent to deliver and that I had not yet delivered because the door was not fully closed, and what was being said inside, it was directly relevant to my life, and I had learned long ago that information directly relevant to my life was worth the risk of the few extra seconds it took to collect it. Cornelius said his son was 26 years old and unmarried, and that the situation of an unmarried man of 26 needed certain accommodations that the household was not currently providing, and that he had decided to provide them in the form of the girl from the fields. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had noticed the girl. The way he said it told me everything I needed to know about the nature of his noticing. I delivered the coffee. I kept my face at the expression I kept it at in that house, The expression that said I was exactly where I was supposed to be doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, and required nothing from the room I was in, except to be allowed to complete the task I had been sent to complete. I set the tray down. I left. I went to the small room at the back of the house that I had been given when I came from the fields, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about what I had heard and what it meant and what I was going to do about it. My name is Lisette. I want to tell you that name with the full weight of everything it carries, because my name is one of the few things in my life that has belonged entirely to me, that no transfer of ownership or reassignment of function or decision made in a study by a man who owned me could touch or take or repurpose. My mother gave it to me. She was a woman named Cora, who had been born in South Carolina and sold to the Aldridge plantation when she was 17, and she had given me the name Lisette because it was the name of a woman in a story her grandmother had told her, a woman who had been beautiful and clever, and who had survived things by being cleverer than the things were dangerous. My mother died when I was 11. She died of overwork in the tobacco fields in August, which was the month that the tobacco fields required the most, and which was therefore the month that most reliably took the people who had least to spare. She died in 2 days, and I held her for the second day, and she held my face in her hands in the last hours, and she looked at me with everything she had ever wanted to tell me, concentrated into that looking, and she said, "Be clever, Lisette. Be cleverer than what they think you are. Be so much cleverer than they can see that by the time they understand what you are, it is already done." She died before morning. I had been being clever ever since. Clever in the field, which meant learning everything about tobacco, every stage of the cultivation and the curing and the grading and the specific knowledge that experienced tobacco workers accumulated across years, and that I had accumulated across 12 years of watching and doing and remembering. Clever in the way you had to be clever when you were the age I was, and you looked the way I looked on a plantation in Brunswick County, which meant understanding exactly what was coming toward you and having a plan for it before it arrived. I had been thinking about what was coming toward me since I was 15. Now it had arrived. Garrett Aldridge was not a stupid man. I want to be clear about that because the story I am telling is not the story of a clever woman outwitting a fool. Fools are easy. Fools are manageable. Fools give you so many openings that the difficulty is not finding them but choosing between them. Garrett Aldridge was not a fool. He was intelligent in the way that men who have been given everything and have also worked to understand what they have been given are intelligent, with a real grasp of the systems he operated in, and a real capacity for strategic thinking about how to operate within them. He was also, and this is the thing that mattered most for what I was planning, a man whose intelligence was entirely directed outward, toward his father's approval, toward the tobacco operation he would eventually inherit, toward the social world of Brunswick County's planter class, whose approval he required and whose opinion of him he monitored with the attention of someone whose sense of himself depended on being well regarded by people he respected. He was not directing his intelligence inward. He was not asking himself the questions that would have been most useful to ask. He was not asking what the woman his father had given him was thinking. He was not asking what she knew, or what she had observed, or what she was planning, or what 12 years of working in his father's tobacco fields and 6 months in his father's house had given her access to that she had been using that access to learn. He was not asking because the question did not occur to him. It did not occur to him because he had been raised in a world that did not produce that question, a world that said the people who worked for you were not thinking about you in strategic terms, because strategic thinking was what people like him did, and the people who worked for him were not people like him. A world that had organized itself entirely around that distinction, and that maintained the distinction by ensuring that the people on the other side of it never had occasion to demonstrate otherwise. I had 12 years of demonstrating otherwise stored up, and 6 months of house access that had given me things the field had not given me. Let me tell you what the 6 months in the house had given me. The Aldridge House in Brunswick County was the center of a tobacco operation that extended across 2,000 acres and 108 enslaved people, and a commercial network that connected Brunswick County to Richmond and Richmond to the Atlantic trade that moved Virginia tobacco to England and the Netherlands and the Ottoman Empire and wherever else in the world people paid for the particular quality that Brunswick County soil and the particular curing methods that Cornelius Aldridge's operation produced. Cornelius Aldridge was a man who kept meticulous records. He kept them in a study that was locked when he was not in it and unlocked when he was in it, which meant the study was available when Cornelius Aldridge was in it. And Cornelius Aldridge was in it every morning from 6 until 10 and every evening from 7 until 9. And during those hours, he sometimes required things from the house that the housewoman brought to him, and the housewoman was me. And I brought them with the particular efficiency that meant I was in the study briefly and completely, and that the brevity concealed the completeness. I read everything, not all at once, over 6 months. A document here and a letter there, read in the 15 seconds that delivering coffee or removing a tray provided, retained with the complete accuracy of a memory that had been training itself for exactly this kind of retention since I was old enough to understand what retention was for. What I read told me the complete shape of the Aldridge operation. It told me about the tobacco factors in Richmond and their commission arrangements. It told me about the warehouse in Petersburg, where the cured tobacco was stored before shipment. It told me about the 3 neighboring planters with whom Cornelius had business relationships of varying complexity. It told me about the note held by a bank in Richmond that had financed the most recent land purchase and whose terms included conditions that the operation was currently meeting, but not with the margin of comfort that Cornelius's correspondent suggested he would have preferred. It told me about Garrett. Cornelius's letters to his lawyer in Richmond about the estate planning that would eventually transfer the operation to Garrett revealed more about his assessment of his son than any direct conversation would have revealed, because people write to their lawyers with a candor they do not produce in conversation with anyone they might see again. What Cornelius wrote to his lawyer about Garrett was this: that Garrett was capable and that the operation would survive his management, that Garrett's judgment in business matters was sound, that Garrett's judgment in personal matters was less sound and had produced on 3 occasions in the previous 5 years situations that had required Cornelius's intervention, and that Cornelius did not wish to be required to intervene in again. He did not specify the situations. He did not need to. The shape of what he was describing was clear enough and was consistent with what I had observed of Garrett in 6 months of proximity. Garrett was a man whose personal judgment was overridden by his appetites, and his father had just handed him me. I thought about this for 3 weeks after the conversation in the study. I thought about what I had, what I knew, what access the coming arrangement would give me that I did not currently have. I thought about what I wanted and what was possible and what the distance was between those 2 things and how to close that distance with the tools available to me. What I wanted was simple and enormous. I wanted out, not from Garrett specifically, not from the Aldridge plantation specifically, out from the entire arrangement that had organized my life since I was 9 years old, and my mother's life before me and her mother's life before that. Out from the system that had decided I was property and had allocated me according to its own needs, and had given me to a man in a study in Brunswick County for his personal use, without asking me anything about what I wanted. Because what I wanted was not a category that the system recognized. Out. I knew what out required. I was not a naive woman. I had not been a naive girl. I knew what freedom cost for a person in my position in Virginia in 1850, and I knew the channels through which it could be pursued, and I knew that those channels required resources I did not have. What the coming arrangement with Garrett Aldridge was going to give me was proximity to resources. And something else, it was going to give me time. Garrett Aldridge came to me for the first time in October of 1849. I will not detail what the coming was or what it required of me, because what it required of me belongs to the category of things I survived, rather than the category of things I describe. What I will tell you is that I approached it the way I approached everything that was required of me in those years, with the part of me that was present for what was happening, and the part of me that was somewhere else entirely, in the place my mother had shown me existed, the place that was mine absolutely, and that no one who had access to my body had access to without my permission. Garrett Aldridge never had access to that place. He thought he did. This was the most important thing about him, and it was the thing I used. A man who believes he has complete possession of a woman will not watch her carefully. He has already decided he knows what she is and what she has and what she can do with it, and the decision is that she is his and she has nothing he does not give her, and she can do nothing he does not permit. This decision produces a very specific quality of inattention, the inattention of someone who believes they have already seen everything worth seeing and have nothing more to look for. I had been working with inattention my entire life. I was very good at it. Garrett gave me access to his rooms, which were separate from his father's rooms, in the way that a grown man's rooms in his father's house were separate, with their own entrance and their own sitting room, and the particular privacy that a father extends to a son in acknowledgement that the son is becoming the man who will eventually run everything. The rooms contained his personal correspondence, his financial records, his private accounts separate from the plantation's accounts, and the particular detritus of a man's private life that accumulates in the spaces where he believes he is unobserved. I observed all of it. I learned Garrett Aldridge the way I had learned his father. Completely. Over months. The shape of his finances, which were more complex than his father knew, and included debts to two men in Richmond that did not appear in any of the family correspondence I had read. Debts incurred in circumstances that Garrett had not shared with Cornelius, and that the 3 previous interventions Cornelius had referenced in his letters to the lawyer suggested he was aware might exist. I learned his relationships with the Richmond factors and with the neighboring planters and with the men in Petersburg and the network of obligations and favors and carefully maintained appearances that constituted his social existence. I learned his plans. Garrett Aldridge intended to marry, not immediately. He was 26, and his father had provided an arrangement that removed the urgency of marriage for the immediate future. But within 3 years, he intended to approach the family of a woman named Dorothea Pemberton in Lunenburg County, whose father owned a cotton operation of significant size and whose marriage to Garrett would combine 2 operations in a way that Cornelius had been discussing with his Richmond lawyer as strategically optimal. Dorothea Pemberton did not know about me. Her family did not know about me. The version of Garrett Aldridge that the Pemberton family would be presented with would not include me. I filed this. I also learned something about Garrett that his father did not know and that his Richmond correspondents did not know, and that the Brunswick County social world he navigated with such careful attention to his own image did not know. He was afraid of his father. Not in the ordinary sense in which sons are afraid of their fathers, the ordinary deference and the ordinary anxiety about approval that structures most father-son relationships. In a deeper sense, in the sense of a man who has spent his entire life in the shadow of a larger presence and who has organized himself around that shadow so completely that the organization has become indistinguishable from his personality. Garrett Aldridge's intelligence, his business acumen, his social performance, the careful management of his image in Brunswick County, all of it was directed toward a single purpose that he could not have named because it was so fundamental he could not see it from the outside. He was trying to become someone his father would not be disappointed in. He had been trying his entire life. He had not succeeded yet. I understood this because I had read his father's letters, and I had watched Garrett in the presence of his father, and I had seen the specific quality of attention he brought to every interaction with Cornelius, the quality of someone who is reading the room for evidence of approval or its absence with the alertness of a person whose sense of safety depends on the reading. I stored this understanding with everything else I had. I was 21 years old, and I was building the most complete possible picture of the Aldridge operation and the people at its center, because the more complete the picture, the more clearly I could see where the picture was weakest and what pressure applied to the weakness would produce. The weakness I found took me 8 months to find. It was in the tobacco, not the tobacco itself. The tobacco was fine. Brunswick County tobacco under Cornelius Aldridge's management was among the best produced in Virginia, which was why the Richmond factors paid the premiums they paid and why the English buyers sent letters of preference. The tobacco was not the weakness. The weakness was in the curing. The curing of Virginia tobacco was a process that required specific knowledge that lived in specific people. The enslaved workers who managed the curing barns and who had developed, over years and in some cases generations, the understanding of temperature and timing and the particular judgment calls that the process required, and that determined the difference between premium leaf and second-grade product. The head curer on the Aldridge plantation was a man named Abel, who had been doing this work for 22 years and whose knowledge of the Aldridge curing operation was so specific and so complete that it could not be replaced. Cornelius knew this. The Richmond factors knew this. Abel's continuation in his role was a condition of the quality that commanded the prices that made the operation profitable. Abel was 59 years old. He had a condition in his chest that had been worsening for 2 years. He had told no one about it except me, because I was the person in the community who people told things to about their bodies, partly because I had some knowledge of remedies, and partly because telling someone who was not your enslaver about a physical weakness was safer than telling someone who might use the information to reassess your value. He told me in February of 1850. I told no one. I thought about it for 3 months. And then I began the second part of what I was doing. The first part had been learning. The second part was acting. But acting in the way I had decided to act required something I did not yet have, and that the situation with Garrett was going to provide me. It was going to provide me with money, not directly, not as a gift or a wage or anything that acknowledged the legitimacy of my having it, but in the way that proximity to a man with resources and the inattention that came from his certainty of possession produced access to those resources when the man was not watching carefully enough. Garrett Aldridge was not watching carefully enough. He was watching what he expected to see. What he expected to see was a woman who was his. What was actually there was a woman who was collecting what she needed to leave. I took nothing large, nothing that would be noticed. What I took was the kind of small, consistent accumulation that a careful and patient person can build over time from the margins of a wealthy man's financial life, the small amounts that fall through the gaps in the accounting of a household that is large enough that individual small transactions do not rise to the level of attention. I did this over 18 months. What I built in 18 months was enough, not comfortable, not secure in the way that security usually means, but enough to move and to pay for the first stage of moving, and to reach the people in Richmond who could help with the subsequent stages if you arrived with enough to demonstrate you were serious. I also built something else. I built the case. Not a legal case. The law had nothing for me. The case I built was for Cornelius Aldridge, who was the one person in the Aldridge world who had the authority to produce the result I needed, and who had reasons that I had spent 18 months identifying and developing to find it convenient to produce it. The reasons were these. Garrett's debts in Richmond, which I had documented from his correspondence, were larger than Cornelius knew and were owed to men whose patience was running shorter than Garrett had shared with his father. I knew this from a letter I had read in October of 1850 from one of the Richmond creditors that made the timeline clear with the particular clarity of a man who has been patient for too long. The Dorothea Pemberton marriage, if it proceeded, would expose those debts to the Pemberton family's scrutiny, because the Pembertons' lawyer would conduct exactly the kind of examination of Garrett's finances that the hidden debts could not survive. The marriage would either collapse or proceed under conditions that would require Cornelius to cover the debts himself, which was not something Cornelius had budgeted for, and not something his own financial situation made comfortable, given the note in Richmond. There was also the matter of a letter I had not read but had written, an anonymous letter, in the commercial language I had been studying for 18 months in Garrett's correspondence, delivered through a woman in the Brunswick County town, who moved between the planter community and the free black community, with the particular invisibility that certain women develop when they understand how to be useful to people on both sides of a line that most people think is impermeable. The letter went to Cornelius's Richmond lawyer. It described Garrett's debts, accurately, with the specific amounts and the specific creditors and the specific timeline, all of it sourced in documents I had read and retained with complete accuracy. The lawyer brought it to Cornelius. Cornelius brought it to Garrett. The conversation that followed I did not hear, because it took place in the study with the door fully closed and with an intensity that the household felt throughout without being able to locate its source. What I heard was the aftermath, which was Garrett's footsteps in the house in the days that followed, the particular rhythm of a man who is managing the emotional consequence of a confrontation he did not expect, and that exposed something he had been carefully concealing. I requested an audience with Cornelius 3 days later. I had never requested an audience with Cornelius Aldridge. I had been in his presence hundreds of times as the person bringing what he needed and removing what he did not. I had never presented myself as someone who had something to say. He was surprised. He agreed. I sat across from Cornelius Aldridge in the study where I had read his documents for 18 months, and I told him what I wanted and what I would give him in exchange for it, and why the exchange was in his interest. What I wanted was a paper, a freedom paper, a legal document that said I was no longer property, that I could move through the world as a person rather than an asset, that whatever happened to the Aldridge operation and the people it contained, I was not among them. What I offered in exchange was information, not the letter. I did not tell him about the letter. What I offered was everything I knew about Abel's chest condition and its likely timeline, which was information that affected the curing operation's future and that Cornelius needed to plan around if he was going to have the operation ready to transfer to Garrett in the condition his planning assumed. I told him that Abel's condition was serious and that the curing knowledge needed to be transferred to a successor in the next 18 months, or the operation would face a crisis of expertise at the precise moment when the Richmond note would make a crisis of expertise most damaging. This was true. I offered to facilitate that transfer, to work with Abel on documenting the curing process in enough detail that the knowledge could be taught to a successor, which would protect the operation's quality and therefore protect the factor relationships and therefore protect the value of what Cornelius was planning to transfer to Garrett. Cornelius Aldridge looked at me across his desk for a long time. He was 59 years old, and he had been in the tobacco business for 30 years, and he had built what he had built with a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and the particular pragmatism of a man who evaluated everything according to what it produced. He evaluated what I was offering. He said he would consider it. He considered it for a week. What he was considering, I understood, was not just the offer. He was considering what the offer told him about the woman making it, about what she knew and how she knew it, and what she had been doing with her proximity to his operation for 18 months. He was considering what it meant that the woman his son considered his possession had arrived in his study with a transaction that demonstrated she had been paying more attention than anyone had intended. He was considering whether the transaction was actually in his interest or whether it was in hers, and whether those two things were the same or different. He was a smart man. He arrived at the correct answer, which was that they were the same. He summoned his lawyer from Richmond. The freedom paper was drawn up in November of 1850. I did not leave immediately. I had told Cornelius I would work with Abel on the documentation, and I did because I had offered that honestly, and because Abel deserved the honesty, and because the knowledge he carried deserved to be preserved regardless of what it had been used for. I spent 4 months working with Abel, who was suspicious at first and then gradually less so as he understood that what I was doing was preserving rather than exploiting, and we produced a document that described the Aldridge curing process in enough detail that it could be taught. Abel died in the spring of 1851. His successor was trained. The curing operation continued. I left Brunswick County in March of 1851 with a paper in my name and enough money to reach Richmond and to present myself to the free black community there, with enough resource to be received as someone who had something to offer rather than someone who needed everything. Garrett Aldridge did not know I was leaving until I was gone. He came to my room on a Thursday morning, and the room was empty, and the room had been empty since Tuesday evening when I had walked out of the Aldridge house for the last time, in the particular way that I walked out of everything I left, without ceremony and without looking back, because looking back was expensive, and I had calculated every expense carefully. I was told years later through the networks that carried information about the people we had all been connected to, that Garrett Aldridge married Dorothea Pemberton in 1852, that the marriage was complicated within its first year by the discovery of the Richmond debts, and that Cornelius had covered them and had exacted conditions from Garrett in exchange for the covering that Garrett found onerous, and that structured their relationship for the remaining years of Cornelius's life. I was told that the Aldridge operation passed to Garrett in 1856 when Cornelius died, and that Garrett managed it with competence, if not inspiration, for the following years, until the war removed the foundation that the competence had been built on. I was told nothing about what Garrett thought when he found the empty room. I did not need to be told. I knew what I had left him with, not the freedom paper. The paper was mine, not the money was gone. What I had left him with was the particular experience of waking up to an empty room where he had believed something was his, and discovering that it had never been his in the way he had believed, that the possession he had been certain of had been from the beginning something else, something that had its own understanding of the situation and its own plans and its own timeline that had been running parallel to his without his knowledge for the entire duration of his certainty. I had left him with the knowledge that he had not known what was in the room. That was the arsenic, not a poison in the physical sense. I want to be clear about that. What the title of this account promises, the arsenic, was not something I put in his food or his drink or anything he consumed. I am not a woman who kills with poison. I am a woman who understands that the most complete destruction available to a person in my position was not the destruction of a body, which could be replaced, but the destruction of a certainty, which could not. Garrett Aldridge had been certain of his possession of me for 18 months. That certainty had allowed him to not watch me. Not watching me had allowed me to learn everything about his life and his father's operation, and the shape of his future and the specific weaknesses in that future that could be touched. Touching those weaknesses had produced, slowly, and with the patience of someone who understood that patience was her most powerful tool, the conditions under which Cornelius Aldridge found it convenient to give me what I needed to leave. The arsenic was the certainty that he had something, the discovery that he had never had it. The remainder of his life lived with the knowledge that the thing he had been most certain of had been the thing he understood least completely. That knowledge was what I left in the empty room. I settled in Richmond. I worked as a seamstress for 7 years, building the skills I had into a livelihood that was mine, accumulating the slow, ordinary substance of a free life, which was less dramatic than what had preceded it and infinitely more valuable. I became part of the Richmond free black community that was constructing itself in the years before the war, with the particular urgency of people who understood that the time available for construction might be limited. I met a man named Robert in 1853, a free man, a printer, with my father's kind of face, the kind of face my mother had described to me so many times that I recognized it when I saw it, even though I had never seen it before. We were married in 1854 in the full legal sense, the contract, the paper, the public acknowledgement. The things I had been told for 21 years my life did not admit of. We had 2 children. They were born free. They have never been anyone's property. My mother would have called this the whole of what she wanted for me, would have looked at my children's faces and recognized in them the thing she had been trying to pass forward through the story of the clever woman who survived things by being cleverer than the things were dangerous. She passed it forward. I carried it. My children carry it now. That is the whole of it. That is Lisette.
This is the story of Lisette, an enslaved woman on the Aldridge tobacco plantation in Brunswick County, Virginia, who negotiated her own freedom in November of 1850 through a transaction with her enslaver that exchanged agricultural knowledge for legal manumission. Brunswick County court records document a freedom paper issued in the name of Lisette in November of 1850, one of a small number of such documents issued in Brunswick County in the decade before the Civil War. Cornelius Aldridge's plantation records, partially preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, document the curing process transfer of 1850 to 51 and the succession of the head curer position in the spring of 1851. No record documents what Lisette knew, or how she came to know it, or what she offered in the transaction that produced her freedom. What the records show is only the result. A paper. A name. A woman who was property in October of 1850 and was not property in December. The distance between those two things is the story. Lisette settled in Richmond, worked as a seamstress, married Robert Haynes in 1854, and had 2 children who were recorded in the Richmond Free Black birth records as born free. She died in Richmond in 1889. Her grave is in the same churchyard as Naomi's, which is not a coincidence because the Richmond Free Black community of the 1850s and 60s was small enough that the women in it knew each other and large enough that each of them had a story that the others understood completely. On Lisette's stone, which her children placed, are her name and her dates, and one line that her daughter said she had asked for specifically. It reads, "I knew what was in the room." The people who placed it understood what it meant. It meant everything. If Lisette's story moves in you, the recognition of a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing available to her was not a weapon, but a clarity, a complete and unrelenting clarity about the world she was in and the people in it, and the specific distances between what they believed and what was true. Subscribe now and join a community that refuses to let these voices be the footnotes they were designed to be. These are the stories of the women who were given to men who believed they had everything, who were put in rooms and told to stay and who used the staying to learn the room completely, who were certain of nothing except their own intelligence and their own patience and their own absolute refusal to accept that the certainty of the men who owned them was the last word on what was possible. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Lisette means to you. Because the empty room in Brunswick County, Virginia in March of 1851 is where this story ends and also where it begins. Where a man woke up to find that what he was certain he had never had. Where the certainty itself turned out to be the thing that destroyed him. Where the woman he thought was his turned out to have been from the very beginning entirely her own.